All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Monica McCoubry. I am the Wildlife Education Specialist with the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. And today we're going to be talking about the science of the sandhills. So I will go ahead and share my screen for all of you here. All right, so let's go ahead and talk sandhills today. So this really cool area is, well, I guess I will just show you. It's kind of out in western central Nebraska. It's kind of hard to describe the full area, but I will show you a map for all of you that maybe aren't sure where it is or what it looks like. I have some really cool pictures in here as well. It's really picture heavy this week, which is nice because I'm a visual person and it's very hard to talk about a unique area and a unique landscape when you don't have photos to back that up. So if any of you are familiar, we have it's called the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project. And so every state agency, every wildlife agency in the country is required to have what's called a SWAP, so a State Wildlife Action Plan. And so ours is called the Nebraska Legacy Project. And under this Legacy Project, it's kind of a blueprint for all of our what we call at-risk species and how we should work on conserving them and management and monitoring and all of those things. It considers the sandhills as it kind of breaks it up, but overall it is what's called a BUL, so a biologically unique landscape. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. There's a lot of acronym, so I'm sorry for that. I will actually send all of you a link to the Legacy Project. It is actually working on getting redone, so we will have a different version come 2025. It's being rewritten right now, so every 10 years it has to be revisited. So that's what we're kind of going off of today. A lot of the information I get will come from that Legacy Project, and so just let everybody know. It's a very cool resource if you are interested in Nebraska. All right. So also just letting everybody know that if you have questions and comments, I absolutely love that. Just make sure that we're on topic and that we're being kind to everybody. And otherwise, we do have that right to remove you from the program. I also want to point out that I don't have a master's degree or a PhD in the sandhills, but I do spend a lot of time there. I did a lot of research. I've read a lot of books and have personal experiences from that area. So I'm a science communicator. So that is my expertise. So I'm just going to communicate to you about all of the science and the very cool things that happen in the sandhills. So. All right, so let's go ahead and get started and talk about I wanted to do a little bit of a history of the sandhills because a lot of people weirdly don't know what the sandhills are. If you try to go to a presentation and talk to fourth graders are about the age where they start to understand where that is. But if you mention the sandhills to my 5-year-old daughter, she talks about seashells and going to the beach. And it's really hard to sometimes grasp and fathom that Nebraska has these very interesting stabilized sand dunes. It's very similar to the Sahara Desert. I know that seems like an exaggeration, but if you've truly been to the sandhills, you know what I'm talking about. So let's talk a little bit about just the kind of how this became a thing and how do we have this in Nebraska when we also have deciduous woodlands in the east and we have prairies and shortgrass prairies and tallgrass prairies and we have the river bluffs and we have the Pine Ridge in the western Nebraska. So how do we have this thing? So it was here. It's been here for a long time. When we say the first human inhabitants, they were nomads and they used primitive weapons to hunt different animals that were in this area. So there were indigenous peoples here long before colonialism moved across western Nebraska and kind of showcased those sandhills. So they were a resource for people. So they used their primitive tools and they hunted things like mammoths and horses and camels and now other extinct species. So yes, Nebraska did have camels and horses. So if you ever get a chance, there's some very cool state historical parks in Nebraska. Ash Falls is one that you can go visit. Agate is another one. You can see some of these fossils up close and personal, which is very unique. So Nebraska also had about a dozen tribes that at least we know of that were known to have lived or hunted in the sandhills. So there's very little record of the indigenous peoples that were here. So we kind of go off of stories that we have heard and scientists, estimate what we can find and the science behind what we're finding, the artifacts that were left behind. But humans likely date back the use to about 10,000 years ago. ago. So we had a dozen tribes ish that lived in this area and that used this area. And then the first year-round settlements where they actually stayed year-round in the Sandhills likely occurred about 1,000 to 2,000 years ago. So they were using this area, but it maybe wasn't somewhere where they thought that they could spend the year. And if you've ever, been to Nebraska in the winter, it gets pretty harsh. So the different tribes that have been recorded in those areas were the Apache, Pawnee, Comanche. I'll let you read all these, but the Cheyenne, the Omaha tribe, all of these have been known to that were presently included in the Sandhills and had used the Sandhills historically. All right, and so moving to Euro-American visitors, so the the Europeans that came across, the first people that kind of came across the Sandhills were likely trappers and hunters. They lived along the streams in search of game species, so things that they could eat, and hunt were things that they wanted to utilize those resources in those areas. The first known non-Indigenous explorer that actually wrote about his account of the journey, his name was James McKay, and in 1796 he made a kind of an exploration of the Sandhills, and he called them a quote, a great desert of drifting sand. So which doesn't look like it here, but if you've ever been to the Sandhills, there's blowouts, there are dunes. It looks very similar to a desert where you would go. So he was kind of the first person to actually write an account about the first non-Indigenous person to write an account about his journey. And then in 1854, there was a guy named G.K. Warren, who was kind of tasked with this idea of surveying a map of the Trans-Mississippi West. From 1855 to 1857, he kind of moved through the Sandhills and he commented on the settlements that were here in the region. And he said that it was highly unlikely that anyone would use this area because of its unfavorable climate and lack of soil fertility. I mean, he wasn't wrong that it is unforgiving. It's arid. It is not maybe the best place for farmland, but that doesn't mean that it was useless. So I would have to disagree with him. All right. One of the things that the Sandhills now are known for and kind of have also historically been known for is the potential for rangeland and the potential for cattle. So it wasn't until about 1870s that the cattlemen began discovering the Sandhills as a potential for rangeland. So one of the first ranches was organized in 1877 by E.S. Newman. It was on the Niobrara River, and he had cattle in his ranch, and he provided those cattle to the Native Americans that were living in the Pine Ridge Reservation. So basically the cattle had kind of free range. They were in these really rugged areas of the Sandhills. They were doing fairly well until a blizzard came in 1879 and it scattered the cattle across the Sandhills. About 6,000 cattle had kind of gotten loose and they were on just kind of adjacent lands in that area. So what happens is that at the time cowboys came in, they found them, they recovered them, but they also found very large herds of cattle that were fat and they were watered. And they basically had been thriving in the Sandhills. So it wasn't this unforgiving place that a lot of people commented it on. Cattle did fairly well. And so they got a little bit more free range of the Sandhills. So in 1880s, the Sandhills then kind of became a very important cattle raising region. So it has historically been known like that, and it still is actually presently like that as well. So once that was kind of figured out, this potential for having this cattle, most early ranches, they were very large and the cattle were left unfenced and basically could graze freely. If you know anything about cattle grazing, we know that that's a no-no now. We like to rotational graze. We like to move them. We don't want them just to free rein. But at the time, that wasn't a practice that was done. If any of you are history people, you might have known of something called the Kincaid Act. So Moses Kincaid, he was actually a congressman from O'Neill. He secured the passage of the Kincaid Act in the 1900s. Basically, this act encouraged settlement in the Sandhills. It increased the maximum claim of acres from 160 to 640. So that's huge. And then between 1910 and 1917, Nearly 9 million acres of the Sandhills were claimed by what were called kincaders, so people seeking those settlements and those acreages. And then in the 1930s, ranches kind of discovered this idea of switching to rotational grazing systems because farming was failing and ranching was succeeding. So with all those ranches, they knew that they couldn't keep this practice up for so long. So they started this rotational grazing system in the Sandhills. What does ranching look like today? So about 95% of the Sandhills are maintained as native grasslands that are primarily for livestock production. Ranch sizes kind of vary, but we definitely know that Western Nebraska is a little bit more rural than places like Omaha and Lincoln. So cattle actually outnumber people 20-1 in the Sandhills. There's about over 500,000 head of cattle supported in the Sandhills annually for various reasons. But also one of the things that started happening in the 70s is people are like, let's start crop production in the Sandhills. So this was not a great idea. One of the people actually called it the low point in Sandhills history. It just isn't a place where agricultural crops thrive. It's more of a cattle ranching area. So this was kind of a low point in the Sandhills. It was a misguided and very unsuccessful attempt to farm large portions of the Sandhills. It did not work very well. So since then, numerous cropped lands at the time have now been reseeded to grass, and they've been put in what's called the CRP, or the Conservation Reserve Program. So we've gotten better at understanding the Sandhills and the way that it kind of interacts with the people. And so I just wanted to take a few minutes just to talk about the history of the Sandhills, because I like history and I think it's interesting of how it evolved to how it is today, as much as we don't like to think that people have or should have a say in the land sometimes. They did, and this is kind of how it came to evolve to what it is today. All right, so that was the history and the land use. Let's talk a little bit about what are the Sandhills. So like I mentioned, if you've never been to the Sandhills, I highly recommend it. So Nebraska Sandhills encompasses about 19,300 square miles of sand dunes, about 265 miles across the state, which is huge. If you think about Nebraska is a very large area, very large state, but this is a small portion of just what our ecoregions look like. And then about 95% of that land, or about 12.75 million acres, is rangeland. So that's a huge portion of what it still is today. The Sandhills, what we call the ecoregion, is the largest stabilized dune system in the Western Hemisphere, and it's one of the still largest intact grasslands of North America. So it's a very unique area. Here's a little map for you if you're kind of unsure where the Sandhills are. They kind of get broken up. So when we talk about that Nebraska Legacy Project, they break Nebraska up into 4 what are called ecoregions. So if you look at the very east, that orange area, that's called the tall grass prairie. So that's Lincoln and Omaha, where 66% of our population is. And then as you move west, that central location, you get 2 ecoregions right there. You have the mixed grass prairie. So towards the east, you're going to have taller plants. Towards the west, you're going to get a little bit shorter, but they are mixed. And then you have the Sandhills region. So it's kind of broken up into that big area in the north central Nebraska. And then you notice there's this like little, it looks like a ghost to me, this little ghost region down here. This is what's called the Les Canyons. Very interesting, very different, very bluffy, but it's still technically part of the Sandhills. And then as you move western Nebraska, you have the shortgrass prairie. But this is what the Nebraska Legacy Project considers our ecoregions in the state. And there's different animals and plants that can be found within those ecoregions. All right, so if you haven't been to the Sandhills, here's a quick video. There's no sound on your end, so if you're looking for it, sorry, it's not coming. Just a drone view of kind of going over the Sandhills. All those cedar trees, there's some cedar trees in there, but there's also some trees, but it's hilly. A lot of people don't understand this is Nebraska. We're not just flat. If you go to western Nebraska, or if you go to Panorama Point, it's actually higher than the Mile High City, which is Denver. So we have some terrain, we have different ecoregions, we have different elevations, so it's not just flat. All right, so How old are the sandhills, or what do they look like? So throughout the history, they're fairly young. When we talk about geologic history, they're fairly young when we talk about the sandhills, but there have been several major episodes of dune formation that have occurred in about the last 13,000 years. But geologically, the sandhills are very young when we talk about the Earth. During those several periods, it's been drought induced, and the sand movement has occurred within the last about 1,000 years. Scientists kind of speculate that in the history of the sandhills, it was a sea of blowing sand, very similar to today's Sahara Desert. I wasn't kidding when I said that. It truly is like the Sahara Desert. And then sandy dunes are very poorly developed. They have a thin layer of topsoil that contains very little organic matter due to their geologically young age. So the dunes are basically aligned primarily in a northwesterly to southwesterly direction in accordance with the prevailing winds. And some of those dunes, if you've ever been out there, are about 400 feet in height. So they get quite tall, and very similar to like a desert that you would go visit. I went to for some reason, I'm totally blanking on the name. Namibia, geez. I went to Namibia and we saw the desert out there. And granted, it's very different than we have here in the sandhills, but there were a lot of characteristics very similar to that desert in Africa to Nebraska's sandhills. All right, what's the climate look like? Considering it's Western Nebraska, they get a little less precipitation than the eastern part. So they get about 23 inches in the very kind of eastern side, closer to that Lincoln and Omaha area, just with the deciduous and the tallgrass prairie. And then as you get more towards the western side of the sandhills, they get about 17 inches of rain per year. This is an average in the west. So the temperatures kind of vary. Very different within the last 10 years, but on average, the high is about 88 degrees Fahrenheit in the midsummer, and they get lows on average of about 9 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter. So very big range of temperatures. And then it is viewed as a semi-arid region, very sandy soils, low precipitation, and very high evaporation rates because they support so many dry grasslands. So with this climate, it makes this very unique area where a lot of plants and animals thrive. And we'll talk a little bit more about what lives here in a second. But one of the things a lot of people don't know is there's a ton of water in the sandhills. So when we think about waters and rivers and streams, we think maybe more eastern side of the state, which you're not wrong, but there are quite a few lakes and rivers in this area. So the sandhills have numerous lakes and even wetlands. There's specific wetlands called the Sandhills wetlands that are found in that area. There's also a very high infiltration rate, up to about 10 feet per day. So all this rainwater and snowmelt, when it's there, it percolates down through the sand, and the water table's very high. So every time there is a rainstorm or there is snowmelt, it just percolates down, but then it comes back right up because the water table is so high. There's also extensive aquifers, about 900 feet thick, have formed mainly in the sand and gravel deposits in the sandhills. And then many of those lakes in the valleys are wet meadows, and they are supported by that groundwater reservoir. Many of you know the Ogallala Aquifer. It holds about 700 to about 800 million what are called acre feet of water. That's how it's measured. So if you would like a retrospect, like how does this compare to something else, that 700 to 800 million acre feet of water is about double the amount of water that's found in Lake Erie. So this is below Nebraska, not just our state, it goes all the way to Texas, but that is how much water is in there. And then about 2.4 million acre feet of water is spring-fed stream flow, and that is discharged annually. So it gets renewed quite a bit. So that's why we need the rain. It percolates down in there. And a lot of people think it's like a big underground river. It's not, but there's a lot of water available. If for some reason we would need to tap into it or something would happen, it's nice to know that that's a resource. All right, there's also more water. So when we talk about there's a high water table, it intersects the ground surface. There's about 2,000 shallow lakes and over 1 million acres of wetlands that have formed because of this. So many of those lakes and wetland marshes, they're clustered near stream headwaters because that's where all the water's coming from. And that's mostly in the western portion of the Sandhills. And there's also over about 1,000 acres in size. Some of them are very large, and they're all fairly shallow. The greatest depth of any of these is only about 14 feet. So very high water table, not super deep lakes or rivers or wetlands or anything, only go about 14 feet. And then most of them have a neutral pH. However, there are some alkaline wetlands and lakes were kind of salty, and they come in the western Nebraska and the Sandhills. Basically, the salts and the carbonates have accumulated in those wetland soils, which makes them kind of an alkaline or kind of a salty kind of texture and different types of water in there. So it's not necessarily fresh water, it's not salt water, but it's salty, if that makes sense. All right, here's another video, or just a picture, sorry, of some of these sandhills lakes. So this is the sandhills. It does not look like a desert of sand, but these are those 2,000 shallow lakes, streams, wetlands, wet meadows, and a lot of them are really right there at the end of the headwaters because that's where the water overflows, and that's why wetlands are so important because they help with infiltration and they help with flooding control, so they're very important. A lot of the times when people ask me, this is a random question, but I always think of the Sandhills. When people ask me where the best place in Nebraska is to see a tiger salamander, the Sandhills. And people are kind of like, what do you mean? Sand and amphibians don't really work well together. And I said, well, right after a rainstorm is the best time to find them in the Sandhills because there's so many shallow lakes and ponds. And if you ever drive through the Sandhills, especially after a rainstorm, there's lots of birds that use those as well, and lots of animals that will utilize that water too. All right, there's also a special type of wetland called a fen wetland. If any of you are subscribers to Nebraska Land magazine, I believe it was this last time or the time before, there's a really cool article about what fen wetlands are. So sometimes in some places in the Sandhills, there are these very long and deep wetlands, and so you can actually stick your hand all the way down in there and the water is like freezing cold. So I would highly recommend that article. I can actually send it with you in this links if anyone is interested when I send you the link for the YouTube video. So the Sandhills region contains some of the Great Plains' largest fen wetlands. They're groundwater fed, and they have what are known peat or muck soil. So basically, they're found at the heads of streams and the headwaters where all this groundwater discharge is very abundant. And that organic soil in there can be about 21 feet thick, and it's formed from the buildup basically of that undecomposed plant material over thousands and thousands of years. And so once those fens are gone, they have a very, very long time to be replaced. So it's one of those, again, unique systems and ecosystems within those sandhills. All right. There's also a ton of rivers in the Sandhills. So there's southeasterly flowing streams. Many of you might know the North Loop, Middle Loop, Calamus, Cedar, the Dismal rivers. A lot of those places are in the Sandhills. The Dismal River is in Nebraska is known as one of the hardest places to kayak / canoe. It's just a stream that kind of looks like this. It's very hard. It's a difficult river if people are looking somewhere to test their skills in kayaking. Just make sure you know what you're doing before you go out there. There's also the Niobrara River. Many of us are familiar with that. You might have gone tanking or tubing down the Niobrara. It is the only Sandhills River that actually originates outside of that ecoregion, but it's a very large river that a lot of people use for outdoor recreation. The headwaters are actually in eastern Wyoming, so it's quite large. And then we have a lot of those smaller streams as well. Some of those you might, Birdwood Creek, Pine Boardman, a lot of those different creeks and streams that you might be familiar with as well. All right, so that was water and like the history of the Sandhills. So now we're going to start getting into the plants and the animals that live there. So let's start with the plants and the vegetation community. So when we talk about the plant community, there are about 700 native plant species that have been documented in the Sandhills. So these are, a lot of those even are at-risk species, so at risk of becoming threatened or endangered in Nebraska. But really it has this large plant community. So we have upland prairies, we have wetlands, we have the fens, we have the sand dunes. So all these cool little places in the Sandhills create this really neat and very unique plant community. So there's two principal plant communities. There's dune prairies and valley wetlands is what we call them. And so there's a lot of different things that you can see when you're in the sandhills. So one of those being grasses. So grasses are a huge portion of Nebraska. We are technically a prairie state, and we have a lot of prairie grasses. And a lot of these grasses are sand adapted. Some of them consist of not just in the sandhills, they're found in other ecoregions as well, but there are some that are specifically in that area. So a lot of you, I'm sure, have probably heard of bluestem, prairie sandreed, hairy grama. A lot of those are in the prairies and also the Sandhills of Nebraska. As far as forbs go, it's not quite a grass. It's a little bit thicker, but there's things like buckwheat and plains gayfeather, the really purple flowers that you might see. Stiff sunflowers found there quite a bit as well. There are even some shrubs. Lead plant, it's very cool. It's purple, it's a pretty plant. And then prairie rose, yucca plant as well. Yucca, basically about the time you hit Kearney, you start seeing yucca. And then there's a very unique area in the sandhills called a blowout. So if any of you are familiar with having young children, you don't want blowouts, but blowouts in this instant are actually pretty good for the sandhills. They're what we call wind excavation depressions. And basically they look just like someone took one of those things that you clear out your leaves in the fall and just blew out the sand. So it's a very unique ecosystem. And we'll talk about a plant here in a second that's only found in prairie dunes or prairie blowouts in Nebraska. But these habitats are known for blowout penstemon. So it's a pretty purple flower. It's actually a threatened species in Nebraska. It's a very rare species and it only grows in Nebraska sandhills and then a very few dune areas in Wyoming. The blowouts today are very common, or not very common. They're decreased because frequency of fires that have been there on the landscape and also the range management practices. And it limits the effects of the erosion on wind erosion on these blowouts. So here's what a blowout looks like. If you're not really sure what I'm talking about, it's basically these areas where wind has moved the sand and there's a lot of plants that will grow in this area. And this is the one that I'm talking about, blowout penstemon. So this is a very cool plant. It's only found in places in Nebraska sandhills and then a few areas in Wyoming. It is considered a threatened species in Nebraska. Actually, I think it's an endangered species in Nebraska, but very cool plant, very pretty. So if you ever find some of these, let people know. If any of you have land or have seen those in the sandhills, let some scientists know because we're trying to find those and document them and help make new habitats. I was just at a division meeting today, and one of the things that our Natural Heritage Program is working on upcoming for the new year, that's our group that deals with all of the non-game, so non-huntable animals and all of the basically at-risk species. They're trying to artificially create blowouts so this plant will then thrive more in Nebraska. So I'm interested to see how that research project kind of continues. All right, there's also woodlands in Nebraska. There's also woodlands in the sandhills. So there are native woodlands. They're pretty uncommon, but they are found in fire protected areas like river valleys and bluffs. The middle Niobrara River Valley contains more extensive woodlands in the sandhills than any other place. When you find these woodlands, you're going to find things like plains cottonwood, peachleaf willow, coyote willow. Basically, those are the ones that really dominate those riparian or riparian woodlands. So anywhere right by the stream is what we call riparian. And then also the middle Niobrara area has things like paper birch, quaking aspen, bur oak, basswood, black walnut trees. So some that you can find in other places in Nebraska too, but those are the ones that are found in the woodland areas of the sandhills. And then the Middle Niobrara River Valley has been called a biological crossroads of the Midwest, just because of the diverse mixture of the plant communities that are there. So for those of you that know Nebraska Master Naturalists, I just talked about that training earlier. Our training is going to be at Niobrara Valley Preserve, which is owned by the Nature Conservancy. And so we'll get to see all these really cool things up there. This is a really cool picture of some paper birch. There's some turkey tail mushrooms on there. There's some cottonwood. Leaves, but just kind of a cool picture if you're not really sure what those trees look like. All right, and there's also wet meadows in the area. So these wet meadows, they have very fine or sandy loam soils. They have freshwater meadows that support things like sedges, prairie cordgrass, switchgrass. And then there's also those alkaline wet meadows, so kind of that salty wet meadows. But then we also have these prairie freshwater marshes. Ripgut sedge is found there, hardstem bulrush, common reed. There's also inland saltgrass, which is very unique to those areas because they're plants that have adapted to living in that kind of salty environment. Bluegrass, scratchgrass. There's also fens, so that peat or muck soil that's found in the wetlands. It supports nearly 20 at-risk plant species, so just in the fens of the sandhills. And then also those alkaline marshes that we talked about, they're alkaline tolerant plants, so salt marsh, bulrush, Nevada bulrush, and lots of different other plants. Technically, this picture is the Pine Ridge, but I liked the picture and I wanted to put it in. Does anyone know what this is? It is a yucca plant, kind of a cool yucca looking plant towards the back there. This is up by Fort Robinson, actually, so not technically the Sandhills, but I did like the picture. All right, so also let's talk some animals that are in this area. So we'll go through kind of the major categories of animals here. Birds. So bird species, there are about 300, more than 300 actually, documented species of resident. So birds that live there year round, and migratory birds, birds that move in and out, that have been documented in the sandhills. The Sandhills area is a very stronghold in Nebraska for things like sharp-tailed grouse and the greater prairie chicken. Those are great places to find them. The Sandhills are also an important breeding site for the world's largest sandpiper, which is the long-bill curlew. I'll show you a picture here in a second. There's substantial breeding populations of things like upland sandpiper, vesper sparrows, lark buntings, grasshopper sparrows, and of course our state bird, the western meadowlark. The American Bird Conservancy has dubbed the Sandhills the, quote, best grassland bird place in the United States. So if you're looking to go see grassland birds, go to the Sandhills. The Sandhills also have very high concentrations, the highest concentrations in the state, actually, of northern harriers. So if you're like, I want to see a northern harrier, well, then you better go to the Sandhills. Ferruginous hawks are also common breeders in the western Sandhills. They're very pretty, kind of reddish looking hawks. Ferruginous hawks are only kind of found in the west, so great place to see them is the Sandhills. Over 250,000 waterfowl have been recorded in May during breeding seasons. Things like mallards, blue-winged teals, northern pintails. It's a great place to see them because there's so much water. Think about all the Sandhills lakes and the meadows in there and the wetlands. Great places for those breeding migratory birds. Things like Wilson's phalarope, American avocets, grebes, tendrils, black-billed magpies are also there. Bell's vireos, rose-breasted grosbeaks are really known kind of in the woodlandy areas of the Sandhills. So no matter where you are in the Sandhills, you got 300 plus species of resident migratory birds that you can probably find. So go to the Sandhills if you want to bird watch. Here's a couple birds that you can find. So sandhills, this is clearly not a native species, so this is a pheasant, but it is a stronghold for areas in Nebraska. Pheasants do bring in a lot of money and a lot of game cash for things like conservation and education, so I guess we can't not like them that much, but this is an introduced species, but there are a lot of habitat things that we have done to work with pheasants and also pollinators, so having these introduced species is something that also helps other species as well. But great place to find them is the Sandhills. This is that curlew, the long-billed curlew that we talked about. Very cool bird. It kind of looks like an ibis. If you've even been to Florida, they have that really long beak that's really unique. This is that grouse. The sharp-tailed grouse is really neat. Something that you don't see everywhere, but this is the Sandhills are a stronghold for this species. It's also a game species as well. Prairie chickens, very cool. North Platte area is a great place to go see them. If you have never seen prairie chickens do their dance in April, I would highly recommend it. There's lots of blinds that you can rent out and even free places around the North Platte Brady area that have blinds that you can go out, and outfitters also go out with you and will show you the prairie chickens and the cool dances that they do. This is a male prairie chicken. They have the really cool balloon-like sacs on the sides of their face. They stamp the ground. They put up their pinna or their tail, their ear feathers. They look like ears, but they're just feathers, and they try to get the girls. So very cool display if you've never seen them. All right, and then there's a lot of mammal species too. So one thing to remember about mammals is that mammals are very widespread, especially in the sandhills, and there's no direct correlation or affiliation with a lot of these species. So basically, if you see one in the sandhills, coyotes, for instance, very common in the sandhills, but they're also very common in Lincoln, Nebraska. So it's a very different, it's not like the birds where this is the place to go to see mammals. You can see mammals in the sandhills, but you can also see them other places. So there are about 55 species of mammals that have been documented in the sandhills. When you think about it, we only have about 85, depends on who you talk to, 85, 90 species. So more than half you can find in the sandhills. We also have small mammals, things like Plains pocket gophers, white-tailed jackrabbits, the Ord's kangaroo rat, very cool, prairie voles. We also have those larger mammals, things like mule deer, white-tailed deer. There are small numbers of elk and pronghorn that are also there. Coyotes are super common, like I talked about earlier. A lot of the riparian areas, so the places along the woodlands and the river streams, bobcats are known to kind of hang out there. There's also several confirmed sightings of mountain lions in the area. The Niobrara River Valley has been one of the newer units that we have talked about as far as resident populations of mountain lions, where a female has had kittens, and we call that a resident population. There's also one of the rarest mammals in Nebraska you can find in the sandhills. It is a subspecies, the Bailey's eastern wood rat, which is what this picture is here. So cute. He's a little subspecies that's only found in north central Nebraska. So it's called the Bailey's eastern wood rat, very unique species. If anyone wants to guess what this is a Ord's kangaroo rat. If you look closely, they have these huge long back legs. They have that very long tail. These guys are super cool. They can hop, and they have fur-lined cheek pouches, and they never drink water. So they eat all the food and they get their water from their food, but they have to travel really long distances. So they will store seeds and stuff and nuts in their mouth, and they have fur-lined cheek pouches, which is super cute. This is a mule deer. So mule deer in Nebraska mostly inhabit, technically they're statewide, but mostly you see them in the western part of Nebraska. The Sandhills is a great place to see them. This is kind of the phase right here in the middle of Nebraska where you start ending with the whitetail in the east, and then you get the muleys in the western part of Nebraska. So mule deer have a little bit larger ears. They have a little bit different butt or rump pattern. They have the black tail and not the white tail. And then this guy, pronghorn, there's some really good populations of pronghorn in the sandhills, very unique animals. They don't have horns, they don't have antlers, they kind of have a mix of both. And they're one of the fastest land mammal in North America, not the cheetah, but they are the fastest land mammal in Nebraska. All right, we also have fish species. So thinking about all those wetlands and lakes that you also have areas of fish. So about 75 species of fish. Nebraska is home to about 100 species, but 75 species have been documented in the sandhills. Many common species that you find just about everywhere. So a lot of them are what we call river generalists. So they can survive in large rivers. They do very well. Things like channel catfish, flathead chub, river carp sucker are there. But then you have a little bit more rare species in the small kind of headwaters and small streams. Things like black-nosed shiner, pearl dace, northern red-bellied dace, fine-scale dace. These are very small fish. Like they look like minnows, but they're technically not minnows. So these guys are a little bit less tolerant of habitat disturbance, and they're not really restricted to stable headwater streams. And then a lot of places in the sandhills have had game fish stocked or introduced to many of those lakes. So things like trout, yellow perch, northern pike, bluegill, bass, those kind of things. This is a picture of a pearl dace right here. So very small. I know there's no reference point, but they're very small. They're minnows. They're technically in the minnow family. So there's those. There's the northern red-bellied dace. So this is a male on the bottom there. You can see that person's hand. They're very little. During the breeding season, the males will turn different colors so that they can attract a female. All right, and then of course, here's our reptiles and amphibians. So there's 27 species of reptiles and amphibians that have been documented in the sandhills. 1 salamander, 3 toads, 4 frogs, 6 turtles, 4 lizards, and 9 snakes. So things like the Great Plains toad, Woodhouse's toad, plains spadefoot, they use this area for breeding. So lots of different lakes and meadows, what areas for them to breed in. The ornate box turtle is our state reptile and has been known to inhabit the sandhills. It's the highest population area of population you can find them. So if you want to find a box turtle, go to the sandhills. And then we also have this really unique turtle, this yellow chinned guy. It's called the Blandings turtle. Nebraska, I just heard the stat today, has about 180,000 of them just in the sandhills. But in the states that surround Nebraska, total, there's about 55,000. So Nebraska is a stronghold for this species. They're pretty common in the sandhills, but if you go to places that aren't Nebraska, they're kind of rare. So Nebraska has this sandhills area that these guys breed. And so if you go to the sandhills, you'll see these kind of high domed shells, and they have that distinctive yellow on their chin. Those are those Blandings turtles. And then also things like six-lined race runner, northern prairie lizard, they're very common in the sandhills. Bull snakes and hog noses are very common as well as far as your snakes go. And then Nebraska also has 4 species of venomous snake. The most common venomous ones that you're going to find in the entire state reside in the sandhills in the western Nebraska, and that's the prairie rattlesnake. So here's the ornate box turtle. These guys do not get very large at all. Kind of about the size of a large grapefruit, to be honest. This is a male, so it has red eyes. Females are going to have gold eyes. This is a hog nose. I know that darn piece of grass right there covers up his face, but they have these really cool upturned scales. These guys are pretty common in western Nebraska and the sandhills. We also have an eastern hognose, which can be found on the eastern part of Nebraska. All right, and then we can't forget insects. So this one I don't have good numbers for just because we don't know a lot about insects, period, let alone do we know about insects in Nebraska in the sandhills. So we do know that the sandhills are an extremely important area for a lot of insect species. Things like pollinators, they're decomposers, they're grazers, they're food for other wildlife. It's the most abundant and diverse and also least studied animal group in the sandhills. One stat that I did find that was kind of interesting is that 27 species of scarab beetles alone have been documented in the sandhills, just in Thomas County. So if you know where Thomas County is, there's 27 species of just scarab beetles that have been documented there. If you're like, I don't know what a scarab beetle is, dung beetles, a great example. There's also numerous species of butterflies. There's also the rarest insect, one of the rarest insect in the sandhills at least, is the American burying beetle. It is one of the last known strongholds for this species here in Nebraska. If you guys remember that map that I showed you, I mentioned the sandhills, and then there's that weird little ghost shape that's kind of detached from the major portion of the sandhills. That area is called the Les Canyons. That's where you find this guy. So this is the American burying beetle. It's a carrion beetle, so it eats dead things, and it lays its eggs on, for instance, when we try to find them, we put a dead rat in a bucket and wait overnight and hope that these guys will come and smell it. They'll lay their eggs on the rat. When their eggs hatch, they will eat the rat. So they are a recycler, a good recycler and decomposer. So this is the carrion beetle. Carrion beetles are actually very common, but the American burying beetle is a little different, and it's very rare in Nebraska. But there are a lot of studies. It's a federally endangered species. There's a lot of studies and a lot of projects going on working at restoring this species, but again, found in the sandhills. So, all right, so that was a lot of our insect species, mammals, birds, fish. We tried to cover it all. There's also a lot of things we didn't get to. Mussels, for instance, we didn't get to, but there are mussel species in the sandhills. So one of the things that sandhills is also known for is that nature-based recreation. So this is a huge thing for the sandhills. It brings in a lot of money ecotourism-wise. A lot of people go there to bird watch. They go there to tank. They go there to kayak. They go there to hike. So it is a huge area in Nebraska that brings in a lot of money for ecotourism wise. So what is there to do in Nebraska sandhills? So a lot of people use it. It is known for upland game hunting and bird watching. So hunting pays a lot of our bills in Nebraska Game and Parks. So we are funded through game cash. So every time someone buys a hunting license, a portion of that license money goes to conservation and education. So if you know a hunter, thank you. They've basically funded this presentation because I'm funded through Game Cash. So hunters are very important, and they're very quintessential part of the Sandhills and also just the conservation world in general. A lot of people also want to go wildlife watch. So they want to find pronghorn, deer, turkeys. This area, the Sandhills, is one of the top places in the nation to find sharp-tailed grouse and prairie chicken hunting in the fall, but also ecotourism in the spring. It's also a premier spot to view prairie grouse courtship as well. It's not just the prairie chicken, it's also prairie grouse. A lot of people come here to see waterfowl in the spring or to hunt waterfowl. Sandhills also, there's great lake fishing. A lot of people talk about walleye, bass become smallmouth bass is the #1 most game fish coming up in the ranks. So a lot of people want to fish for smallmouth bass. There's also places like Merritt Reservoir and Calamus Reservoir. Merritt Reservoir has some of the best scenery and fishing available. Merritt is also the only place in Nebraska that is a international star dark sky. So it is the only park in Nebraska that has a national title designated as a dark sky park. So there's places where you can go view. They have an annual star party. I think it's actually coming up in the next couple weeks. But there's lots of things to do at night. You can go stargazing. There's educational talks. There's lots of things for kids to do. It's very cool. And then also the Sandhills. Nebraska is a very privately owned state. 97% of our land is privately owned, which doesn't leave a ton of public acres left, but there are thousands of acres of public land in the Sandhills. We have 3 national wildlife refuges, 2 national forests, numerous WMAs, which is a wildlife management area, and then also a SRA, which is a state recreation area. And then there's also 56,000 acres, the Niobrara Valley Preserve, which is where I'm going Tuesday, so yay me. It's owned by the Nature Conservancy, so they have an area up there as well that the Nature Conservancy owned in the Sandhills. And then also Niobrara River. It's one of the top canoeing destinations in the country. Around 20,000 people come and visit annually just to do that. Also inner tubing, kayaking, canoeing, tanking. I'm sure all of us have done the tanking portion before. And then also the Cowboy Trail is something that was recently finished, and it's a biking trail that spans the entire area of the northern Sandhills. Very cool area as well. So here's a few pictures. If any of you have been to the Niobrara River, here's really good kayaking. The scenery is amazing. The river is fairly easy to intermediate depending on where you are. So a great place to go kayaking or canoeing. I'm sure all of us have done this before, tanking. There's a lot of outfitters in that area that specifically people will come to the Sandhills to do this activity. There's a picture of the star party in the Sandhills here. Is there like anything more, Nebraska, like if you Google search Nebraska, this would come up. The windmill, the stars in the back. So International Dark Sky Park, the best places to see the stars at night. And then also here's just another picture of areas in the Sandhills, people doing just various recreational activities. Here's another area. Fishing is another huge portion in Nebraska. So people buy fishing licenses and specifically go to Sandhills lakes to do fishing. So I think that was the last slide. It is. All right. So hopefully that gives you kind of a cool idea of what the Sandhills are and this very unique area in Nebraska. A lot of people, in the very beginning of our PowerPoint, they talked about this useless drifting sea of sand. It's not. It is a huge stronghold for lots of areas and recreation and fishing and insects and plants and animals. So very cool area. So I hope you all learned a lot about the Sandhills. We are already almost to the end of our 6-week season here of Science Of. So we have one more next week on Thursday. We're going to be talking about everyone's favorite animal in the world, ticks. So we're going to be talking about their biology, their history, what do they do, what are they, why are they important? There's a good importance, I promise. And then also, if you are interested in more, we have about 80 Science Of videos on our YouTube channel. So if you like fungi, if you like birds, if you like snakes, there's tons of that stuff on there. I also highly recommend liking us or following us on Instagram or Facebook. And then we do have a wildlife education website where you can download activities. There's PowerPoints, lots of free things to use. All right, so thanks everyone. We will hopefully see you next week for ticks. I know it's not your favorite animal, but if you want to learn about them, come join us next week. So, all right, I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing this program here. I'm gonna check to see if we have any questions. All right, someone had a good question. Are cedars indigenous to the Sandhills, and do they create a long-term threat to the area? So it depends on who you ask. There are, I believe, on the invasive species website with UNL, they list them as an invasive species, but they are technically native to Nebraska. At the time, a lot of people would plant them for like windbreaks, and they do a great job. However, they kind of just take over everything. There are a lot of animals that use them and use them as, especially in the winter, as wildlife sanctuaries. Kind of a lot of people will use them. A lot of animals will use them, but they're just very hard to get rid of. And there's a lot of animals, for instance, like the prairie chicken, that needs big open spaces where we don't want those cedar trees. So it's kind of a controversial question. It depends on who you ask. It depends on the area. But I think technically, I think Game and Parks also lists them as an invasive species. We do a ton of management, cedar management, trying to get rid of them. There's like the hack and squirt method. There's fire. They're just very hard to get rid of. So someone put in the Nebraska Star Party, July 28th through August 2nd. Thank you. There's also that great website there. So thank you, Pamela, for doing that. Looks like, I think that was it. That's all the questions. So if you guys have any more questions, just please email me. But I hope you learned a lot about the Sandhills today. I was really excited to do this one. If you have any questions, let me know. I will be sending out an email for everyone with some information, and I can also send out that Star Party information too. So otherwise, we'll see you next week for ticks. Have a great week, everyone. We'll see you.